Good evening. It's a joy to have all of you here tonight. Welcome to the Wade Center. Welcome to this very special evening when we are gathered together to remember our friend and colleague, Chris Mitchell. Chris and I had the great privilege of serving here with Chris for almost 20 years and continued our friendship certainly once he went to California, and it's just wonderful to be here with so many friends, and I'd like to particularly mention Chris's family that's here tonight, Julie Mitchell Martindale and Wayne, and I see Luke and Sarah and Carter and Heidi coming in, and Rashawn. So welcome. It's just a great joy to have you here, and just a pleasure to be able to gather together in this way. It's also my joy tonight to introduce Bruce Johnson. Bruce is a longtime friend of the Wade Center and of mine. He serves as associate pastor of Mountain View Presbyterian Church in Scottsdale, Arizona, but it is due to his role as general editor of Zing Zuk, the C.S. Lewis Journal, and as president of the Arizona C.S. Lewis Society that we have had the great pleasure of having Bruce visit the Wade Center. Numerous occasions he's come to do research in the Kilby Reading Room. If you know Bruce at all, you know he is dedicated to helping others. Anyone who's ever worked with him knows his kind heart and his deep desire to be of service to others. One example of this is that Bruce is the one who organized and oversaw all the efforts to honor former director Chris Mitchell in this volume. Indeed, we wouldn't be gathered here this evening apart from Bruce's considerable efforts. As anyone knows who has attempted such a feat, inviting authors, securing a publisher, setting deadlines, then prodding all these authors to meet these deadlines, and then prodding them again, and then editing copy for publication. It's no task for the faint-hearted. But Bruce did all of this and more because of his love for the writings of C.S. Lewis, as well as his warm friendship with Chris. C.S. Lewis once posed a rhetorical question in a letter to a friend and former pupil. Is any pleasure on earth as great as a circle of Christian friends by a fire? Well, we don't have a literal fireside here in the Bakke Auditorium this evening, but in this special book that is being launched tonight, we do have the flame of scholarship that the editor Bruce Johnson has lit, as well as a circle of Chris's friends who have gathered around this literary light. We're very glad that all of you here this evening can be part of the circle of friendship. Before I invite Bruce to come up here and tell us more about this memorial volume, I'd like to mention, too, that Bob Trexler, Bob, where are you? Bob is the publisher of this volume, so we're indebted to him and just delighted to have him here this evening with us. It is just such a great joy to be here to celebrate Chris and to celebrate Chris's life and ministry and his work on C.S. Lewis. Please join me now in welcoming the editor of the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis, Bruce Johnson.
Marge, thank you. So this is a story with three beginnings. I am a Presbyterian pastor, so when I say a three-part story, you're thinking a three-part sermon. You know, three main points in a poem, and there is a poem and does have three parts, but it really is a story with three beginnings. The first beginning is how I met Chris Mitchell. The second beginning is a lecture that Chris gave in 2008 that became the organizing structure of this memorial volume. And the third beginning is how this project started. So with that, I'd like to start with the first beginning. It's 2004. I'm sitting in my office at church, and I get a call out of the blue from somebody who says he's the director of the Marion Wade Center. His name is Chris Mitchell, and he wants to take me out for breakfast. And I'm convinced at that moment that he has dialed the wrong number. I didn't understand that at all. A couple months before that, we had gathered a few friends together to start the Arizona C.S. Lewis Society. We thought, well, what are we going to do? Well, we'll have a book study, once a month. We will provide forums for visiting Lewis scholars that come by Arizona. And we will have some sort of newsletter, that would be nice, that we will use to put in new academic work exclusively about C.S. Lewis. And at that point, we imagined it would be 16 pages, photocopied, collated, stapled, and distributed locally like a church newsletter, because that was my world, right? Church newsletters. And I could not understand why Chris Mitchell wanted to take me out to breakfast to talk about our church newsletter. It just didn't make any sense. So I said, well, Chris, I will agree to go out to breakfast with you on one condition, that I can bring a friend with me. I needed backup for this. So I asked Grayson Carter, who's the author of the first chapter of the Memorial Volume, to come to that breakfast. And what happened then was basically that Chris convinced us that we needed to step up our game, that we were involved in something that was unique, a academic journal focused exclusively on C.S. Lewis and his writings. It was something like, wasn't quite like Seven, it was a little bit different. And at that moment, we did not know about the parallel effort taking place at Oxford University among the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society, which became their chronicle of the Oxford University C.S. Lewis Society, and later their Journal of Inkling Studies. We didn't know about that, so Chris convinced us that we needed to step up our game. And what we did became Sehnsucht, the C.S. Lewis Journal. So that is the first beginning. The second beginning was in 2008. The world premiere of the Chronicles of Narnia, the exhibition, was due to have a big blowout VIP event on June 5th at the Arizona Science Center. And Chris called me up and he offered to give a lecture before that, the evening before that, Thursday, June 4th, to the Arizona Lewis Society. I said, great. Chris, what do you want to speak on? He said, I want to speak on the future of Lewis-related studies. And he was of two minds about what to call that lecture. He said, well, it's either going to be the unexplored C.S. Lewis or the undiscovered C.S. Lewis. I said, Chris, we need a definite title because we have to send out publicity. So about 2 months before, he said, okay, we're going to go with the unexplored C.S. Lewis. And that's what went out to all the churches and the society and libraries and whatnot. And then the night of the event, he switched. And so it became the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis, New Thoughts and Directions in Lewis Studies. And it was a time when the future of Lewis-related studies was uncertain. The long-awaited third volume of the Collected Letters of C.S. Lewis had just come out, but there was this lingering sense among scholars, people were either hot or cold about Lewis. It was academic feast or famine. And Chris had an idea of where we needed to go as the third generation of Lewis scholars who beginning to emerge. The first generation of Lewis scholars happened beginning in Lewis's own lifetime, and I probably went through just after he died in 1963. There were two volumes, a tribute volume to C.S. Lewis called Light on C.S. Lewis, edited by Jocelyn Gibbs. That came out in 1965. And then the first Letters of C.S. Lewis, compiled by his brother Warren, that came out in 1966. I think those two volumes ended the first generation of Lewis scholars. The second generation of Lewis scholars is the next 40 years, in which we saw over 24 posthumous collection of Lewis essays and short stories appear in print, and major biographies were completed by Roger Lancelin Green and Walter Hooper, Humphrey Carter, George Sayer, and A.N. Wilson. And as the third generation of Lewis scholarship began to emerge, it was a legitimate question to ask, haven't we done everything on Lewis? What more is there to be done? So Chris, on that night, laid out 6 categories, 6 emerging trajectories of where good scholarship on C.S. Lewis would take place in this third generation of scholars. Here are the 6 categories. Number 1, historical studies that set Lewis in his own time, since he is no longer a contemporary writer. He is a 20th century writer, and you may have noticed that we are living in the 21st century. So it's not our native land anymore. And you have to lay out what that native land was like, what people were concerned about or worried about, what they were hopeful about. You need to set that as you talk about Lewis. Second, were reassessments that clarify previous misreadings of his work or misunderstandings of his biography. One example of this is the debate Lewis had in 1948 with Elizabeth Anscombe, which has been often commented about and often misunderstood. So, but there are many things of Lewis's biography that need to be filled in here or there, or understandings of his work or his writing that's just wrong and needs to be corrected. Third, comparative studies of Lewis and other thinkers and writers of his own day or earlier. This is the Lewis and Aristotle type work that would go on. Fourth is assessments of what Lewis wrote and thought in light of current writers and current trends, particularly postmodern and post-Christian thought. Fifth, explorations of his lesser-known material. And at the moment, almost anything that comes out of Lewis's professional writing, his literary criticism, has become lesser known. And sixth, previously unpublished material by Lewis, such as his Elizabethan play We're All Waiting for Lewis the Bald, that one day will see the light of day. And along with these 6 categories, Critch said that we also must help future scholars know about good writing on Lewis that has been done in the past. We must look back and remember, even as we look ahead. It was a wonderful lecture. It was marvelous. And on that night, the new recording equipment in our church broke down. So in some ways, this book makes amends for that failed recording. But those categories still guide the work of Zainzuk, and they became the framework for the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis. All 6 of Mitchell's original categories of emerging trajectories are represented in this volume: historical studies, reassessments, comparative studies with past writers, interaction with current thought and current writers, exploration of his more obscure work, and new Lewis material. Now, if you want to match up the chapters to those categories, you have to go to page 373, where in the index I've hidden that. And that is my understanding of where I would put these chapters among those 6 categories. And the other chapter authors who are present may have other ideas and better ideas about that. But this is just the way that's helped me organize and think about that as the editor. Individual chapters examine aspects of Lewis and his writing from a variety of disciplines: history, literary studies and criticism, philosophy, theology, apologetics, biography, imagination, mythology, ethics, Christian spirituality, cultural studies, and rhetoric. David Downing's contribution was originally published in 1998, and in this new context is an example of good academic writing on Lewis from the past. And one essay each focuses on 3 related authors: George MacDonald, Dorothy Sayers, and J.R.R. Tolkien, providing additional historical literary context. Together, they chart the course for the future of Lewis studies. The third beginning of our story, of course, occurred on July 10th, 2014, the day Chris Mitchell died. Now, here's the thing. When I heard that news, I experienced 2 things simultaneously, and one of them I understand, and the other continues to be a mystery for me. So one thing that I experienced immediately was grief and sorrow. I had lost a friend. We had lost a friend and colleague. And at the same time, the other thing I experienced was this thought: my goodness, Chris didn't live to be 70 when we would have had his friends come together and write a tribute volume and present it to him. I don't know why that happened. But as C.S. Lewis reminded us in his book, The Four Loves, for a Christian, there is, strictly speaking, no chances. a secret master of ceremonies, has been at work. This is the year Chris Mitchell would have turned 70. And there is a sweetness in that fact that is beyond my ability with words to express. Now, you will suspect from all this that the rest of the story is simple. You would think that I wrote to various scholars with the idea of following Chris Mitchell's 6 tangents and adding in a good old essay for good measure, and then the Chris Mitchell Memorial volume would have come together nice and neat. No, that's not what happened. The story is a bit more interesting. With the encouragement of Jerry Root and Marge Mead, and really thanks again to Jerry and Marge. Without your encouragement at the very beginning, none of this would have happened. So thank you. With that encouragement, I put together a list of scholars with their help and sent out this email. Shortly after Chris Mitchell's passing, Jerry Root and I began discussing the idea of a memorial volume to honor him, technically called a Gedenkschrift rather than a Festschrift because he had passed. Now, with the blessing of the Wade Center, we begin that task in earnest. Chris had a lasting influence on many scholars, and it seems appropriate to ask some of those scholars to contribute original articles to this project, particularly articles of the type they think Chris would enjoy. We are hoping that you would consider being part of this collaborative effort. Though it is likely many such contributions will be in the field of C.S. Lewis scholarship, it is equally fitting that others relate to either historical theology, which was the subject of his doctoral work, or to one of the 6 other authors whose work is the focus of the Wade Center. Did you catch that? I simply asked them, write something Chris would enjoy reading. And what emerged was something reflective of his own understanding of where we needed to go. My original email closed with these words. Thinking about this collaborative effort, I am reminded of a line from J.R.R. Tolkien's Noll and Lindley, thank you. And here's the quote, which is a poem. But I will sit and hearken and be glad that through you, great beauty has been awakened into song. In a way, that's what Chris did. His one great gift was taking delight in the work of others. And I close by saying thank you in advance for considering being part of this common effort. Now let me say something about the essays that did not make it into this collection. Brett Foster died before he could write his proposed essay, George MacDonald, Literary Interests and Leads. Bruce Edwards passed long before he could complete revisions on his lecture given in France, A Message in the Bottle, C.S. Lewis's American Epistolatory Friendships. That essay, along with a earlier proposed address by Walter Hooper entitled The Friends of C.S. Lewis, will appear in the upcoming volume of Sehnsucht. Don King's piece on Lewis and George Herbert's The Temple can be found in Sehnsucht, Volume 13. Arndt Schmidt's exploration of why Lewis did not become a philosopher is now part of Inkling Studies Supplement, Volume 2, that came out earlier this year. Serena Higgins' creative essay on Charles Williams and J.K. Rowling may yet see the light of day, as may my proposed earlier essay on the LaFay fragment. And Jason Lepo-Yarvi's reassessment of the Four Loves is in the hands of the Harvard Theological Review. If all of these essays had been added to what we have tonight, the combined book would have been in excess of 560 pages. And it was very difficult finding a publisher willing to move forward with the tribute volume as is, just under 400 pages. Fortunately, Bob Trexel of Winklehagen Press caught the vision for what we were doing and where we were headed. And that was the final piece of the puzzle. Again, from The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. Friendship is not a reward for our discriminating in good taste in finding one another out is the instrument by which God reveals to each of us the beauty of others. Beauty revealed. Beauty awakened into song. These are some of the remarkable gifts we received through our friendship with Chris Mitchell. And to his memory, our words and our work are humbly dedicated. Thank you. And now I'm going to ask that the contributors all come here, and we are going to all channel our inner poets, because we're going to try to express things with brevity. So let's all line up here, and one at a time we will say who we are and how we met Chris Mitchell, and a 1-minute summary of our chapters in the book. So I'll start. I've already told you about how I met Chris Mitchell, and Marge has explained who I am. And my chapter is on the shorter planetary fiction of C.S. Lewis, looking at Michael Ward's planetary cosmology theory for the creation of Narnia, and using Lewis's shorter planetary fiction as a test case to see if it holds up, and it does.
I am Crystal Downing, the co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center, and I met Chris Mitchell the first time I came out to do research here, which was in 1994, his first year here. My essay is entitled Dorothy L. Sayers and C.S. Lewis at War, and I start by talking about their different responses to World War I. Not many people realize that Dorothy Sayers was in France when the war broke out, and she immediately wrote home saying, "Oh, please, 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 may I stay? This is so exciting." She transferred that excitement to a different kind of war, a war of words with C.S. Lewis, and some of their words got weaponized. She wrote Lewis one letter saying, "Dear Mr. Lewis, oi, oi, I see I must willy-nilly write you another letter." And he wrote back, "Dear Miss Sayers, hey, whoa." But I talk about how this battle between them was to their mutual benefit, and it is no coincidence that Douglas Gresham reports that the first time he ever saw his stepfather cry was when C.S. Lewis heard about the death of Dorothy Sayers.
I'm David Downing, the other co-director. I first met Chris 7 years ago, or 7 years ago, 1994. We had a good conversation about Lewis and Lewis studies. My favorite memory among many conversations is I came out in early 2000s to Chicago for a conference, and I called Chris and said, "I'd love to come over to the Wade and check out some citations." And he said, "Well, actually, we're closed between Christmas and New Year's." But he agreed to open up the building for me just to check a few citations. And then we sat up in his office, which is now Crystal and my office, talking about C.S. Lewis and Jonathan Edwards, of all things. The surprising similarities between those two thinkers. My contribution is called The Figure of Merlin in That Hideous Strength. In that novel, Ransom tells Merlin, "Our Lord does all for each, and one of the reasons that you were reawakened is so that your soul might be saved," which is kind of a striking thing to say about Merlin, that his soul's in need of saving. So I did some research on why Merlin, as a magician, was doing danger to his spiritual wholeness. That Lewis said that the old wisdom was to conform your will to reality. The new wisdom is to try to make reality conform to your will. And some people try science and some people try magic. But the ultimate theme there is the dangers to your soul of trying to make reality conform to your will.
Hi, I'm Neal. I met Chris Mitchell when I took a class with him at Wheaton College in year 2000. It was a Christian thought class. And we became friends and spent time together, and he became a mentor to me over many, many years after that. The chapter I contributed to this book is called Recovering the Mythic Imagination. And G.K. Chesterton said this. He said, "In the darkest of the books of life, there is a law, and it is this: if you look at a thing 999 times, you're perfectly safe. If you look at it for the 1,000th time, you're in frightful danger of seeing it for the first time." So keeping that in mind, I write about the mythical imagination, which was very dear to Lewis, I think. It was an imagination that was most prevalent in the medieval age. The medievals found great significance and meaning in their world and their worldview. That worldview was ultimately overcome by the scientific worldview. So I take a look at that, and Lewis describes this all in his magnum opus work, English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. So I look at that. I look at how Lewis, I think, used some of these ideas in his own work, and how important it is for us even now to recover that mythic imagination such that our world can be re-enchanted. And the idea of re-enchantment was something that was really important to Chris Mitchell, such that we can then see our world as if for the first time.
I think I failed to introduce myself when I started. So I'm Marjorie Lamp-Mead, Associate Director of the Wade Center. And I first met Chris when he applied to be Director of the Wade Center. So, and as I said, we served together for almost 20 years. My chapter in this memorial volume is called The Theological Imagination, C.S. Lewis as Reader and Author. And I think we all know when someone reads Narnia that they almost inevitably, whether they know it or not or articulate it, come away with insights that we might call spiritual insights. But Lewis would say, that's not what I want you to get most out of this. I want you to delight in the story. He wanted people to start there. He didn't want people to know Aslan was a Christ figure or this or that. And so in this essay, I try to explain part of what Lewis was trying to do, part of what Lewis himself gained from story, because story was so important to him, and what the transcendent, the theological imagination is what helps us really understand the transcendent in a way that just simply talking about it won't do the same thing. You learn more about the love of God in some ways from reading about Aslan and experiencing it. It brings it to life in a new way than just simply if I say God loves you. So that's the sort of insights that Lewis himself was very aware of when he very intentionally wrote stories to share with others what he loved.
My name is Mark Noll. I'm a retired professor of history at Wheaton and the University of Notre Dame. After 25 years of knowing Chris, first I learned from him about Jonathan Edwards when I supervised his master's thesis. And then through many lunch hour conversations at Buswell and here, mostly about the Socratic Club, but other matters, he asked me if I'd take part in a conference here in 2013 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. I'd long thought that the reception of Lewis in America was interesting because Catholics were much earlier readers and much more appreciative than evangelicals. And this seemed an opportunity to work on that topic. My wife, Maggie, at the time was being employed by the University of Notre Dame to work 10 or 12 hours for me as a research assistant. She did great. Her boss was often faulty. But she did a terrific job digging out, I think, all or almost all of the published responses to C.S. Lewis in America. So for my essay, I did a brief skim of those, and turns out Catholics loved him a lot. Evangelicals come on the scene very late. Since this is America, where it pays to advertise, a fuller account of what Maggie did will be presented in this room beginning January with a lecture on Catholic approaches of Lewis before 1947 and his appearance on Time magazine. Second lecture a little bit later on Lewis in the secular media, and last and least for that period, Lewis and American Protestants.
I prepared my remarks because I was told to be short. I'm Max E. Birch. I'm a professor at John Brown University. I met Chris and Julie at St. Andrews, Scotland in 1988, where we were both doing grad work at St. Mary's College. We became close friends during that time and remained friends through the years that followed. Many of you have experienced Chris's ability to be a close, insightful listener. Our last conversation focused on how happy he and Julie were in their recent transition to Biola for this next exciting chapter in their life. And I could hear the joy and energy in his voice as he shared about spending the last years of his academic career teaching and engaging with students. Now, this last conversation with Chris provided the context for the chapter I contributed, Teaching as Translation and the Theological Formation of Imagination. It's an exploration of Lewis as a teacher-translator, extended to a proposal that argues for teaching theology as the theological formation of students' imaginations. 7 years ago, I'd been teaching theology for a number of years, and I came to the conclusion my course was boring. And part of the reason it was boring, if it was boring for me, I know it was terribly boring for them. And I realized part of the reason was because I was teaching theology as though theology primarily was abstract ideas that happen inside our heads, when in fact theology is a life we live, and it must be embodied. But in order to do that, we must re-engage students' imaginations and find ways to do that so that God can redeem that too. And so I changed my class and began teaching in a new way that involved theological art projects and eating together and talking about theology. And it re-engaged me, and it seemed to re-engage them. And so I wrote my chapter as an extension to some degree out of my experience with that. One last thing, I'd like to thank Bruce Johnson for the privilege of contributing in this tangible way of honoring Chris and Julie, and to commend him for his steady, persevering, and faithful commitment to this project.
I'm Wayne Martindale, Emeritus Professor of English here at Wheaton College, and I knew Chris pretty much from the beginning of his time here, even before he became director of the Wade Center. My love and esteem for him has only grown over the years, as I'm sure each person in this room who knew him would say. And as Julie and I were both preparing for this book launch, we listened to Chris's last sermon. And I said, after I heard that, we have to find a way to get this out to other people. So you can make that a prayer request that we'll be able to forward Chris's legacy as it has come down, at least in part to us and to many of you. So Julie is Chris's widow. My first wife died in January of 2017. And in the providence of God, after Julie moved back to Wheaton, Alan and Rhea Johnson, Wheaton College, kind of did the honor of connecting us with each other. I'd only known Julie at a high, glad to meet you level until that time. But one thing about Chris that might indicate the way we worked together and esteemed each other, when I went to China for 2 years, 2006 and 2008, I said, Chris, would you like to come and do some lectures? And he said yes. So I arranged 7 lectures for him to give at 3 different universities and a couple of church venues, and we had a high old time. Every fun thing I could think about to do in China, we did, and it was a blast. The title of my chapter may serve as an executive summary, From Suffering to Service, Edmond's Spiritual Formation. When we meet Edmond in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he's snarky, peevish, jealous, spiteful, unjust, and before long, an outright traitor. In short, Edmond is a kid in perpetual need of a spanking, and a spanking he would get. But by the end, he's an Aslan/Christ follower, humble yet courageous, interested and invested in the needs of others. How did he get from wretched to righteous? Using a pattern of spiritual formation he encountered in Evelyn Underhill, Lewis gives us a true-to-life account of Edmond's spiritual awakening through a path of suffering. I'll give just one example of Edmond and his spiritual maturity. In Voyage of the Dawn Treader, after Eustace, the record stinker, has made his own journey through suffering to become undragoned by Aslan, Edmond becomes his chief comforter. Here's a snippet of their exchange just after Eustace confesses that he has been pretty beastly. "That's all right," said Edmond. "Between ourselves, you haven't been as bad as I was on my first trip to Narnia. You were only an ass, but I was a traitor." That's a mature self-assessment. To the point, Edmond has become so full of Aslan, Christ, that his love overflows in counsel, comfort, and service to others.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Schmidt, and it is my privilege to serve at the Wade Center as our archivist here. I started working as a student worker in 1999, and that's when I first met Chris. I took classes with him too here as a student, and he became not only my coworker, my teacher, but also my friend and my mentor. So I loved him a lot. You will quickly notice in the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis that my chapter is shockingly not about C.S. Lewis. While I love Lewis, Chris and I shared a special bond over the works of one of the other Wade Center authors, J.R.R. Tolkien. Because of that bond, and honestly, before I knew what the title of this volume was going to be, I decided to honor Chris's memory with a contribution on Tolkien. Chris often brought up the topic of heaven in his conversations and in his personal and theological musings, which I'm sure a lot of you remember. Reflecting on that, I wrote about the closest equivalent I could find in Tolkien's Legendarium, Valinor and Longing for the West. Although Valinor, I hasten to add, is more Edenic rather than a true representation of heaven. The chapter is called Across Western Seas, Longing for the West in Tolkien's Legendarium, and opens with an overview of other European mythologies that share the motif of a Western paradise, showing that Tolkien's use of this imagery in his own mythology is in good company amongst the traditional context of cultural imagination. The themes of longing and imagery of the West are then explored in Tolkien's Legendarium with a few examples, and the end of the chapter has a brief reflection on how such longing manifests in the readers themselves as they read Tolkien's stories, not unlike the experience of Sehnsucht that Lewis describes. I want to add my thanks and congratulations to Bruce Johnson for his long years of work to make this volume possible, and to Bob Trexler for bringing it into print. And I also want to thank the Mitchell family for being here and for receiving this gift from all of us, and for sharing Chris with us over the years. And for that, I am eternally grateful. Thank you.
When C.S. Lewis was dying, he received a visit from Maureen, who was the younger sister of his war buddy, Patty Moore. And she went up to him and said, "It's Maureen." And Lewis opened his eyes and said, "You mean Lady Dunbar?" Because she had, because of circumstances, all the funky British aristocracy that I don't get at all, she had become Lady Dunbar. And Maureen said to him, "How in the world could you remember that?" And his reply was, "On the contrary, how could I forget a fairy tale?" And as this project developed, we were on the sidelines to another fairy tale as Julie Mitchell became Julie Mitchell Martindale. And there's a sweetness in that that warms all of our hearts. Julie, on behalf of your whole family, would you come and accept this, please?
I guess it's okay if I say something, huh? Okay. Well, one evening about a month ago, Wayne asked me a question, and he said, "Would you enjoy hearing a secret about some good news that's been a secret for a really long time?" And I'm like, "What?" And what he proceeded to tell me was a complete surprise to me. Had no idea this was going on. And then when he began to share with me the names of the contributors, tears came to my eyes, because these are people that Chris loves so much, and people that I love as well. To put it mildly, I was delighted, and even Wayne, who completed his chapter before we ever connected with each other and kept this secret from me all this time. Bruce, I want to thank you so much for the vision of this and for all the work that you've put into it to bring it to pass. And Bob, I met you last night, and thank you so much for all that you've done as well. When Chris died in 2014, I got a lot of texts and emails and cards and letters, and there were some websites that were set up where people could contribute remembrances and thoughts and reflections. And I didn't want to lose any of that, so I just kept dragging them into a file on my desktop. And a year later, I left California and moved to Colorado, where my daughter and family live. And I was there for 2 years before I moved back here, which I think I moved back here as a result of that guy's prayers, even though he didn't know who he was praying for. So while I was in Colorado for those 2 years, it just seemed like the perfect time to do something with all of that on my desktop. And this became the result of that. It's called Chris Remembered, Reflections on the Life and Work of Christopher W. Mitchell. And I would like to read to you what Bruce Johnson wrote in 2014. Can it be real that Chris is no longer with us? He reveled in life. In my every interaction with him, he seemed intent on being in the moment. His ability to take in and savor each conversation, each idea, each person, each experience, and each blessing marked who he was. His delight in the day-to-day joys was compelling and infectious. As enjoyable as his personality was and as great as his intellectual gifts were, what stands out in my mind now are his accomplishments. Look at what he did. Chris took over the helm of the Wade Center at a time when C.S. Lewis scholars were divided by controversy. People had chosen sides. It was a dark time. Chris brought his gifts and his engaging ways to the task of healing that rift. Moreover, Chris had a handle on what he described as the unexplored or undiscovered C.S. Lewis. He had a vision for where Lewis studies needed to go in the future, where a more nuanced approach or a further reassessment could yield light. He led a talented team developing the infrastructure to make that academic work possible. Chris did that not only for Lewis studies, but also for the exploration and study of all 7 of the British writers on which the Marion E. Wade Center is focused. Books, manuscripts, artifacts, and oral histories continued to be amassed, cataloged, and made available. Information was brought online. A marvelous building was constructed to house the collection and to welcome all who walked through its doors. Soon, an auditorium will be completed as well. And here we are. The work continues. Once Chris spoke to me of how C.S. Lewis was a great example of a person who took all the gifts God had given him and use those gifts to the fullest for the cause of Christ. Chris Mitchell was a great example of that, too. The world is desperate for more people who would follow in their footsteps. So thank you, Bruce, for making this happen. And thank you, beloved Wade Center, for being that place and those people that he loved for those 19 years that he was director here. The people in this room were important to Chris, and one of his joys in life, and I would say one of his gifts, was in encouraging others in their work and sometimes helping them to gather the resources that they needed for their work. He would have been delighted in this evening because of each of you. I think it's fitting that even his death would be an occasion for celebrating your work that is found in this book for the kingdom of Christ. Chris also had a gift for friendship and bringing people together, which is especially reflected in this room and in this book. Diana Glyer, I think, touched on this so beautifully in her reflection on Chris, which, picked up the wrong book, which I'd like to read too. So let's see, where is it? I cherish Chris as a friend and as an embodiment of friendship itself. Our conversation inevitably would circle back to people we both knew, friends we hold in common, and much of the time Chris would also be conspiring to connect me to someone new. You know what would be fun, he would say. We should get you together with, and then he'd name 4 or 5 people I didn't yet know. We dwelt in possibilities, and I loved being there, getting people together, bringing ideas together, making connections, and infusing them with warmth and vitality. Those were Chris Mitchell's great gifts. Day after day and year after year, I was the glad recipient of those gifts. Warren Hamilton Lewis wrote, quote, "There is something horrible, something unfair about death, which no religious conviction can overcome. Well, goodbye, see you on Tuesday," one says, and you have, in fact, though you don't know it, said goodbye forever. He passes up the lamplit street and passes out of your life forever. And so vanishes one of the best and nicest men it has ever been my good fortune to meet. May God receive him into his everlasting happiness, unquote. Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Simply this: Christopher Mitchell was one of the best and nicest men it has ever been my good fortune to meet. I gotta have a drink. So many people, after Chris died, told me that they had never known anyone who talked more about heaven, and also anyone who seemed more ready to die than Chris. And I can definitely echo that. In his last sermon, which he preached in our church in California, he spoke longingly of the day when not only would he finally be safe from all the darkness of this world, but more importantly, that he would finally be a safe person who would never again violate or hurt someone else. He said that that had become the true glory of heaven for him, and that the truest part of us as God's children is ever moving toward that place. So if remembering him causes us to think about our eternal home and the glories of the fellowship that we will experience there with Christ, that is another fitting result of this effort. And just for fun, I want to read about 2 sentences that Walter Hooper wrote to Chris when he found out that he was leaving Wheaton and moving to California. he says, I don't really need to say it again, do I? That your leaving the Wade is one of the saddest things to happen in my 50 years of Lewis involvement. The Wheaton police should put up a barricade to prevent you and anyone from your family from going beyond the city limits. And all these red tabs on here, those represent the remembrances of the authors of this book. I was also thinking about the fact that each of the directors of the Wade Center were the right choices for the needs and the culture of the Wade at that time. And I was thinking how grateful we should be for God's watchful care over this place throughout the years. So, thank you.
Now we have enough time for some questions. So we have some brilliant minds here. It's amazing that they've all assembled here. About half of the contributors to the Undiscovered C.S. Lewis are present. The other half will have the opportunity to view this as it's recorded and put online. But if you have questions about this enterprise or any questions about what was done, about Lewis or any of the other authors that are the subject of the Wade Center, this would be a good time to ask that. And somebody here probably knows the answer to those. So. And if not, we will go on to the next part.
We have made available the book for sale, and you've had all these tantalizing previews, so you know you want to read this book. And on this day only, you will get a 10% discount. It is for sale at the front desk of the Wade, and Bruce will be in the museum where he can sign copies of your book as soon as you buy it for that 10% discount. And again, it's only for several hours. Then the rest of the contributors have agreed to stick around this area and in the foyer. If you want to chat with them, maybe you have some questions about something that they mentioned in their presentation, or if you just want to buy your book and come get their signatures, their autographs for their individual essays, you may do that as well. So let me close the formal part of this ceremony in prayer. Dear God, thank you for the wonderful words we heard tonight. Thank you for all the love that Chris Mitchell generated. Thank you that he is now experiencing the ultimate love, for you are love. We pray blessing on this place and every single person here tonight. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for coming, everyone.